Leaving, leaving cost me a lot, but at the time I felt that I had no choice but to leave. As I mentioned earlier, when I joined the RAF, I had no educational qualifications because of home life. I'd left home and subsequently didn't do any form of formal education. Once I was in the RAF, I met certain people. One of them, a chap named John Clark, and one of the best people I've ever met. And he went for commissioning. And this one day, when I was in Northern Ireland, he phoned me up and he says, "You should be here at Cranwell." And I thought, me, Cranwell? And I was so embarrassed because I had no educational qualifications. And I started thinking to myself, I ran away from home for a particular reason, to get away from certain behavior. And how long am I going to let that behavior control my life? So I stopped telling what I call my story of woe. And I thought, I'm going to do something with myself. And I started going to night school. And I got my O-levels. I did my O-level maths in 3 months. I did my O-level economics in a weekend. And I just started on an educational journey. Now, by the time I finished that journey, I was in a position where I had the required O-levels or GCSEs, and I could go for commissioning. And I went for commissioning. I did exercise first stage, which I won an award at. And I went to the Officer Aircrew Selection Centre, and I got through the 2.5 day process. At the end of that process, I was told that I was unsuccessful some weeks later, and I was to reapply in 12 months' time, which I was quite happy to do, because I thought it was a fantastic process, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. And then approaching Christmas of 1993, I remember my sergeant was chatting to me at work, and we were talking about the commissioning process. And he said to me, he says, how did you feel it went? And I was singing the praise of the Officer Aircrew Selection Centre. I thought it was fantastic. And he says, well, he said, did they tell you what you failed on? And I said, no, you don't get to. I said, you don't get to see the document. You're just briefed on its contents. And he said to me, he says, well, every year you get your annual 6442, which is your annual appraisal. He says, you're not supposed to see that either. He says, but what happens? And I said, well, you pass it across the table, I get to read it. He says, so why didn't that happen with your report from Cranwell? And I said, well, did you see it? And he says, yes. And I said, look, are you trying to tell me something? And he says, yes. I says, well, come on, let's spit it out. And this is what he said, and I can quote this. He says, you get marked on positive and negative attributes. I said, yes, everybody knows that. He says, yours were tied, and so they wrote one in. And what they wrote in was skin pigmentation. At that point, I said, you're lying, right? And he says, no. He says, what happened? He said, I was in the boss's office, and he says, and the mail came in, and the boss said to me, he says, oh, Jeff's reports from Cranwell's here. And he's sitting there reading it, and he says, my God, that's naughty. And I said, what's that, sir? And he said, that. And he pointed his finger at the document on the table. This chap walked round the table and read what he was pointing at. And he says, oh my God, does that mean what I think it means? And he said, yes. And if they thought it, they should never have written it down. And it was at that point when I found out that, I thought, it doesn't matter how hard I try, it doesn't matter how hard I work, I am not going to get what I want because I cannot change the colour of my skin, and I wouldn't want to. And that is why I decided to leave the RAF.